Pienso Project. This is a podcast for people engaging in the never-ending process of expansion and growth. So the purpose of this podcast is to expand and grow through awareness, introspection, and stillness. We fundamentally understand that relative to all there is to know, we know relatively nothing. So with this in mind, we will consider and reconsider interesting perspectives, ideologies, and strategies for the purpose of self-actualization. Josiah, what's up, man? How you doing?
I'm well.
Good.
It's been a while.
It has.
A couple weeks.
And we're getting into the holiday season.
Mm-hmm.
It's exciting. I mean, who knows when this podcast will be heard? But for us right now, in this present moment, we are gearing up to get festive.
For sure. And hopefully this is a podcast that will be heard during multiple holiday seasons.
Exactly. Yes. The gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of the gift that keeps on giving, I had a very spicy lunch, as you know. And so I may regularly clear my throat. And that's just going to have to be all right. And to all of our spicy food lovers out there, just know that we love you, you know, even if the spicy food isn't always so kind to us. All right.
Sounds good.
What are we talking about today?
We're talking about the difference between fear and intuition. Maybe how they might be intertwined.
Oh, fascinating. I like where this is going. Can you help us out with some definitions?
Yeah, for sure. So fear, good definition is not necessarily my definition, but the one we're going to use. Fear is an emotional response to a perceptive threat or danger. It triggers the body's fight or flight response, preparing us to either confront or flee from the threat. So that's definition of fear.
Physiological response. And specifically fight or flight. I feel like freeze has to be part of this as well.
It could be. I mean, you know, I've heard that before.
Yeah. Okay, cool. What about intuition? What's our definition for that one?
The ability to understand or know something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. It's often described as a gut feeling or an instinctive understanding.
How fascinating. I like that definition. That's cool. That human beings have experienced this phenomenon frequently enough, widespread enough, that we have phrasing for it. We have it's entered our vernacular, instinct, this inner knowing that's not really informed by the facts or data. I think it's probably relevant to ask: Is instinct, is it real?
So, like you were saying, we have formulated a definition, right? It's happened enough, or we can actually say, this is consistent.
Yeah. It
displays these characteristics, therefore. So I think it is, you know, the question was, is instinct real?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's real for now until, you know, process of falsification deems that it is no longer relevant or real.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's real. It exists right now. It's very useful. But I don't think we've fully measured all there is to measure on this particular phenomenon. So
like anything else, it is also subject to obsolescence, or the becoming obsolete, which I think in a lot of contexts is just having a better way to explain it. It's Occam's razor, right? That's like the simplest explanation wins, with the caveat that it has to still fully explain the situation, of course. But if two explanations can provide detail and context for why phenomena occur, then we're going to go with the simpler one. That one's going to win out. And I think that's kind of like my understanding of obsolescence is we just develop our understanding of things over time, and you know we're sense makers. We make sense of the world. So,
which I think that's what instinct does, right? You know, this is going to seem far-fetched, but it seems pretty simplistic to me. You know, we know that we pass down DNA, or that we continue to facilitate the process of DNA, process of, you know, blood, right, is passed down. Like you have the same, a lot of similar characteristics or traits that your parents had, grandparents, and so on and so forth. And so I think that, just in a simplistic, you know, way of looking at it, why can't you pass down fear or different ways of perceiving threat or danger,
Right.
Different instincts? So if you, like the definition said, you're the ability to understand or know something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. The key word I think here is ability, right? Like, did LeBron James have to consciously reason his ability to jump a certain height?
Nope.
Right? Did Einstein have to reason his intellect into being? No.
No.
So, you know, these things are a mixture of the context which they were born in, the different experiences that they had, and then also what's been passed down through, you know, the lineage. So I think, you know, intuition, or the ability to hone your intuition, the instinctive understanding. Some people are born wise.
Right.
Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's the conception.
Exactly.
At least, is that, you know, you're an old soul.
Right.
You're wise beyond your years.
Right.
You know. But what are the ingredients for that? I think we'll get to dig into that a little bit today. And of course, we're observers, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're observing and reporting, and that's kind of our MO here. But it's an exciting task, because I think some people do have a highly developed sense of intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And really, the impetus for this podcast today is, how do we lean into intuition while not conflating it with fear? Because they're both visceral experiences for the human mind and body.
Mm-hmm.
We have this sense of inner knowing, and we feel this confidence, and we don't know where this confidence comes from. This conviction and resolve that this is the best path for me. And I don't know how I know it, but I know it, and I know it deeply, and I trust in that. However, you can also get talked out of that. I'm sure we've all had experiences where we felt really, really strongly about a certain path forward, and then upon reflection and review by our family and our friends, the stakeholders in our lives, the people that we admire and respect, they talk us out of it, right? Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, they do not have access to our intuition, because intuition, and please push back on this if you don't agree, but I suspect that intuition is a deeply personal experience, and that it's a one-to-one relationship with you and yourself.
It is. Most importantly, it's your ability. So we don't have the same ability as anyone else. There are varying degrees of certain characteristics. So, and then it is the development of that ability.
Right.
That's the personal relationship.
That's so funny. That's what I just wrote down.
Yes. So I think as long as we're aware and intentional about those two things, and I'll reiterate, the first is that it is an ability that's inherent to us, and that it's also a skill that can be developed like any other ability.
Right.
Then our being susceptible to outside opinion, and how we deploy that ability, our preparedness, how well we've prepared and developed that skill,
Right.
I think it's a direct there's a direct correlation with what we've done with those two things and what we're aware of about ourselves relative to what other people in our circle, family, or whatever aren't aware of. They're not aware of that context. Or maybe in some cases they are. Maybe they actually see like, oh no, you haven't developed that ability to speak well. Don't go start a podcast, right? Now we can ignore them, right? And we can say, you know what? I have the ability to articulate thoughts and convey ideas, and I'm going to develop that a little bit more. I understand what you're saying. I see my blind spots, and I'm going to do well and prepare for that. Because I've got a gut feeling, right?
Yeah.
I've got an instinctive understanding that I have something to say, and I can say it well.
Yeah.
Right?
You know, it's so fascinating because in my work, we actually measure decision making, right, is incredibly important, and how people make decisions. Those are some of the characteristics that we look at, and so we'll evaluate: are they more of an instinctive decision maker, or do they rely more on the facts and figures and opinions of others? And they're both valuable processes for making a decision. But what is apparent to me right now, as we're talking about this in the context of it being an ability and one that we can cultivate and refine and make stronger over time, it makes so much sense that sometimes we assess job seekers or leaders who they lean very heavy instinctive, right? And this doesn't always mean that they don't appreciate facts and data. Sometimes they really do, but when it comes down to like the last vote, it's their intuition has got it. They're going to trust in that. And in fact, I might be one of those people, but it's also interesting how some people deny their intuition. And I think what I'm considering right now for the first time is that intuition is a muscle.
It is.
And it will atrophy with disuse.
It will.
Wow.
And nothing does that more than learn helplessness.
Ooh, wow. Yeah. Can you bring that full circle?
Yes, I think, or it's my observation, right?
Right.
Maybe there is something more, right? My observation is that when we place ourselves in situations, in environments where we obfuscate our decision-making process, or not working out that intuition muscle, then we don't get that many bites at the apple or swings, at the ball, right? So I think we've got to conquer our fear of being wrong.
Yeah. I was about to say, what makes people afraid to use their intuition? Fear of getting it wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Fear of getting it wrong. Like if I sense something, I think the instinct is more like it's a sensory, perception. You can sense that. It's more like vision, in my opinion, right? You kind of see the scenarios.
Ooh, that's good, because there's a spectrum of clarity there, too.
Yeah. Well, this is how I use it, at least, right? So I may read something, read several things, or have several conversations and kind of can tie some things together instinctively. But then there needs to be a due diligence. And at some point, I've got to act on the original instinctive understanding that I have cultivated over time by sitting with experts, trying to understand what I'm missing, and then being self-critical.
Right. Oof.
And so if at least from what I've observed, if you're able to engage in that process enough and frequently, then your instincts and even your intuition are much more clear and aligned.
Yeah.
Right?
Just for clarity's sake, too, to kind of delineate between instincts and intuition, and I would love to hear your perspective on this, but I think of instincts as like the individual, like a single stimulus. I had an instinct about it. Whereas intuition is like the mechanism from which instincts spring forth. It's the overall, there's an author that I love that talks about intuition as your window into the wisdom of eternity. You know, the collective unconscious, just everything that's been learned so far, following this frame of reference that there is some type of intangible repository of information, right, that we can access if we refine our intuition enough. And I'm like, you know, that's not my theory or anything like that, but I do find it to be really interesting. There's clearly some kind of communication that's taking place between an individual and something that is tethered to that individual that gives them this sense of security. You had said something earlier about, you're talking about being self-critical and how that assists you in like refining, developing your intuition. And it makes sense to me just like intuitively, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, yeah, and I'll before that I will basically give my perspective on you know how instinct and intuition kind of work together. So for me, I think instinct is the underlying mechanism for intuition.
Really?
I think intuition is more scenario based or condition based. I think instinct is kind of always there no matter what.
Okay.
It's kind of like if I had to think about, it was like a David Attenborough documentary where they look at the different UV spectrums that, you know, we can see, animals can see.
Yes.
And they were talking about how certain insects, I think they were talking about butterflies at the time.
Mantis shrimp, they can see all kinds of wild things.
Right.
Can't even imagine.
But what they ultimately are attracted to and they gravitate towards depends on what they can see, or what they can see in terms of the UV spectrum. And so I think with that example, you know, I think them gravitating towards flowers is like their instinct, what they can see on the UV spectrum. But the type of flower is, in this scenario, would be the intuition.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Right? So what's the difference between going to the flower over here compared to the one 50 meters away?
Right.
Right? Why did it skip all the flowers in between? Are they showing up differently on the UV spectrum for this particular butterfly?
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Right.
But there's something, you know, in terms of the intuition that is, it's choosing or making a decision to go to gravitate towards that one. So that's the way I think it kind of works. I think
I like that.
Yeah, instinct is kind of like our UV, like what can we see, our ability to see, our ability to perceive, and then I think or what we gravitate towards, and I think intuition is like when we actually make the decision to select that thing.
Right.
You know?
And a lot of this is taking place subconsciously.
Yes.
Which I think is really interesting. But I like your understanding of instinct is like, if you are hungry, if you have gone without food, instinctually, you will forage. You know, you will try to find food. However, you might come across two different types of fruit, and there's always a chance that one of them could be the death of you. It could be poisonous, you know, and your intuition might steer you.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
That's the way. That's a very human application of it. I'm not sure why I didn't think of that instead of the butterflies.
That's why you got me here.
So then the other piece you were trying self-critical. Yeah. So I think the self-critical piece comes into the the intuition forum,
Mhm.
right? So I think it fits within that, because I mean, we've all witnessed, observed people that aren't, even ourselves, that aren't self-critical at some point. And
Mhm.
you're like, dang, I made this was a stupid decision. Why didn't I think of this,
Well, that is being self-critical, though, right?
Well, and I think post-mortem, right? Retroactively,
I
right,
see.
that occurs.
Yeah.
But I think when you're self-critical, you look at your entire body of understanding and you say, I understand, I'm in this particular situation or scenario, I understand, 5 out of the 10 things that need to be evaluated.
Mhm.
And you admit that you don't understand the other 5.
Oh, I like that.
And so I think if you're, for me, if I'm operating, and I'm being self-critical, I can admit that it emotionally, I can handle, the taxation, and then I could actually reach out and find understanding through subject matter expertise, through, books, through other sources, right, than
Yeah.
my own understanding, because I've met my limitations.
Yeah.
Not in terms of my plasticity, right, or ability to understand, but my experience
Up to the present
up
moment.
to that present moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I think what's also interesting, just to riff on that for a second, is that this practice of being self-critical can be extremely effective, can pay major dividends in your life. However, a bit of a prerequisite for it is I would say, a healthy self-concept,
Mhm.
a foundation that can withstand weight and pressure. Because if you have a highly fragile, let's just call it ego,
Ego,
for
yeah.
now,
Mhm.
it can only take so much reproach.
Yeah.
Like, being self-critical, it could become defeating because you're at war with yourself.
Right.
You're trying to defend and attack at the same time, and that's just not very comfortable.
It's not, but I will say this: if you do it enough, if you become proficient in it enough, you process the emotional taxation of that thing, right? So, like, I look forward to being wrong about something as fast as possible, so that I can learn
Yeah.
and grow, right? So if someone is able to provide me with enough information or context, I'm willing to override my instincts and intuition,
Yeah.
right, around not being wrong or not wanting to be wrong. 'Cause
Right.
It's not even that I do want to be right, but I want to be right based on accuracy, right?
Right.
But there's a difference between that and not wanting to be wrong, because there are plenty of us that will work in a self-defeating manner just so that we're not wrong.
Right. Right. Well, alone, in isolation, there's no value in being right.
There's no value.
There's no value in being wrong either, and there's no cost to being wrong. But there is a major cost to being wrong and a major reward to being right if your worthiness as a human being hinges upon it.
True.
And we exist in that paradigm. And it's just a frame of reference, just a point of view, a perspective. But it's rampant.
It is. I will say, to add to that, because I do agree, there's also a value in being right or not being wrong if you want to optimize yourself. So I think if you're alone and you are seeking to improve yourself, you're going to have to admit what you're right about,
Right.
what you're wrong about by yourself. And I think that is the more challenging thing for most people.
Why?
Because there's no one to blame. Really, there's just all accountability, ownership, right?
Yeah.
And responsibility. And so I think that's what that's another thing. Like when I get to that point of being self-critical, I have to take responsibility for my decisions
Yeah.
that led to my lack of understanding. Oh, I didn't read enough on this
Right.
particular subject. I decided to not do that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me decide to read more on
Right.
this. Accountability has to come into play, right? So I have to say, I chose to do this other thing instead of this. And now I'm unprepared, right, to understand whatever this new scenario that I'm approached with. Let me choose to prepare now,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then I have to take ownership or agency as well. I have to say, I can actually meet this challenge if I cultivate my ability to meet the challenge.
What a powerful frame of reference.
Yeah.
Reminds me too of how, so we were talking about self-concept a second ago, and how we can engage in this incredibly rewarding process if we're willing to not take it as a sign of, or lack thereof, our own worthiness as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's another layer to that as well, that sometimes we're not basing our worthiness on our own opinion of ourselves. Sometimes we're basing it on the opinions of others.
Yeah.
Which is so wild, because I think about the implications of basing your worthiness on some external criteria that at least you've decided upon, right? Like to become successful or wealthy or loved or whatever it is, doesn't really matter. But if you're meeting that criteria, then you're good and you're worthy, and if you're not, then you're bad, you're worthless, and all that good stuff.
Or just unprepared.
Unprepared.
Right.
That's the reality of it, right? But what is also kind of sneaky is that I think there is perhaps a growing group that is not, they don't have any criteria because we live in like this social media rage point in time, but they are basing their worthiness on what other people think of them. And this could be, expanded or collapsed to your inner circle, the people that you really respect and admire, or just anyone, whoever comments on your post.
Right.
And that is even more like shifting sand.
It is.
Than the first topic that we were discussing. And both of them are totally optional.
Yes.
We forget that. But
we exercise the option to forget it. We
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
And I think so that touches on a very interesting topic, which is resentment.
Oh boy, let's
Right.
talk about resentment.
So I think resentment and fear hijack, in my opinion, our intuition. Like what was the term? Fear is an emotional response to a perceived threat or danger.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when we have like all these unresolved like resentments,
Yeah.
we perceive threat or danger a lot quicker than what it is actually there.
Wow.
And we chalk that up in a lot of cases to intuition.
Right.
But really, I think
It's not
It's
at
not.
all.
It's just
Yeah.
like
It's
harbored
unprocessed
resentment.
trauma.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Is there, can you fathom just living in a trauma-informed world?
I think we do.
No. I mean, sorry, I should have been clear. In the way in which a trauma-informed therapist is trained.
Oh, yes.
So,
Gotcha.
And I'm going to brag on this phenomenal group for a second. But last night, Rachel and I got the chance to go to Jonathan's Place, which I don't know if you might have heard of Jonathan's Place. They've been in our community for quite some time, and they serve kids of all ages, but also they have programs for kids that age out of foster care,
Yeah.
which is like this really pervasive issue all across the U.S. And that I've had a little bit of exposure to and gotten the opportunity to work with some of those folks. But they're talking about how they have these trauma-informed therapists on staff that are engaging in these constructive conversations while being mindful of triggers and knowing how to navigate those in a way that we have to open the wound to treat it, you know, and that's tough, right? It's just easier to avoid it. However, if we have the courage to open up that tender spot and treat it, put some medicine on that, then it has the opportunity to heal and to grow stronger. You know, it becomes a mechanism for resilience.
Yeah. And
how interesting would it be, you know, like the world we live in right now, it's, at least in my experience, it's not like that. It's much more so, it's a minefield of triggers and responses, and then the cascading effects. I mean, and these are devastating effects, you know, that impact millions of people, but started like this tightly wound bud, you know, that was just waiting to be activated or triggered. I'm rambling.
Are advocated for.
Yeah.
So I think this is the pernicious thing about harbored resentments, is that somebody comes along and they say the thing that you've been wanting to say. They voice the concern that you've always had. They keep it real when you can't keep it real.
Yeah.
Right? And I think what happens in a lot of cases is it to pick through our definition, it causes or triggers a response in us, a fight or flight.
Yeah.
That is then validated by someone else's behavior. Someone comes along and say, yeah, you know what? Like revolutions. There are a lot of revolutions that are lit because people they're resentful.
They're primed.
Right.
Yeah.
They're primed, right?
Primed with resentment.
Resentment.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe it's warranted.
Right.
Maybe it's just in some cases. But I think to your point earlier, it's not being worked through on an individual level when it's fresh. Because what if you know, somebody said, you know what, I hear you guys, but that doesn't really affect me as much as it affects you guys. No, I'm not going to storm the Bastille, right, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, I'm going to go process this through therapy or whatever it is. I don't know if that's always a positive thing, but I can say we live in a society right now where that's not happening enough on an individual level to avoid groupthink.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And what's fascinating to me is how resentments fester.
They do.
And expand.
Yeah.
You know, I think about, and this is like totally a silly example, but there is a major difference in effort from cleaning dishes night of versus 1 week removed.
Yeah.
You know, it is like it could be a labor-intensive process if you're doing it 1 week after. And I think that it's much the same way, like the curves, the graph of how a trauma can fester and multiply is very similar to that. And it becomes this, we don't want to deal with any trauma, right?
Yeah.
It's painful to deal with. Even in that moment when it's at its weakest, which is right when it's happened, which is ironic, right? Because typically we just want to like cool off. We want to get out of that emotional state and then come back to it when we have a semblance of safety in our lives.
Yeah.
However, I think when we do that, the problem becomes so much stronger and takes so much more energy to combat. And it will continue resurfacing, right, over time. This is a common theme that's been well documented over time, that it will resurface, and we can choose to confront it, or we can choose to push it back down.
Yeah.
And I think we live in a society where the rule is to push it back down. The exception is to confront it or process it. And as a result, like, we wonder why terrible things happen. We're like, how could anyone do something like that?
Right.
But are we aware of the monster that has been growing inside of them for untold years? And this isn't like a 1-to-1 ratio. As we know with the dishes example, this is exponential.
It is.
It's not like twice as long. It could be like 5 times as long, 10 times as long to clean those. I don't know. What
Well, no, I agree. That's precisely what I'm talking about. And I think at some point, that person that's been building up that resentment, they start to become isolated. And there is, I think, really one of two like pronounced examples or concepts. You have like a strong man that comes along, and they're like, "I got you. I'm gonna fix all your problems," right? I think Socrates talked about this and how this is like one of the dilemmas of democracy, because especially democracies that prioritize free speech, because you have plenty of people in a society that build up resentments because things aren't working the way that they should, or the entitlements that a society says that it will provide aren't actually working that way for them. And so you have all this free speech that is occurring on the other side, right? The us and them paradox, or paradigm, excuse me. And someone comes along and they give voice to the people that have resentment. The other option is where these people become, and I say these people, but this could be anyone. Right. We become isolated. And so much so that we are instinctively led, or our intuition says, this is dangerous. This CEO is so dangerous. They're harming people. Go kill them, right? Right. And
they create a campaign.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a crazy, irrational thought. Yeah. Right. There's not much. They haven't done much research, like, to really know for sure, but they're led on intuition to actually carry out an act. Yeah. Right. So I think that's kind of like where resentments lead when you're looking at the impact on a society.
You know what you're helping me to realize right now is that resentment fuels competition.
It does.
Which is so fascinating. I've just been, I feel like thinking to myself for years now how, like, at what point across the long arc of time and the evolution of human history, and I mean evolution here just in terms of like the progression of humans, right? And our societies and the way that we interact and communicate and collaborate. At what point will we move away from this paradigm of competition and infighting to a more holistic and integrated collaborative model, where it's not us versus them, it's just us.
It's us, yeah.
There is no outgroup. And I'm not trying to I'm not talking about a utopia here. I'm talking about like a fairly subtle shift in terms of not how can we be better than them, but how can we be better? It reminds me, like, there's strength in numbers, right? And any group that, you can look at sports, a basketball team that is connected and has high levels of trust and they have chemistry that they've worked hard to develop over time, even if they don't have the same level of talent as the opposing team, they can still pull out a dub in that situation because they're operating on this like collaborative model, even in that competitive environment. But I think that I'm going to tie this back around to resentment. We have all of these unprocessed traumas. Yep. Those unprocessed traumas lead to resentment. And it is so much easier for us at that point to make an enemy.
To create a them.
Yeah, to create a them. And that's
Right.
the campaigning that occurs.
Yeah. And then it really, like, in my opinion, the pernicious thing is when someone comes along and they say, hey, here's a them. Like, we
Right.
see it. We've seen it in so many studies on civilizations where it's like, I mean, you guys obviously were all in this together.
Yeah.
Because the entire civilization collapsed.
Right.
It ate itself, up.
Just how these things happen. They're
Right.
too strong to not survive collaboratively, but divided. The strength is also divided.
Yeah. And so I think when I look at fear and intuition, where they're intertwined in some cases it's whenever resentments aren't addressed. And
Right.
when people, to use the term you use, aren't trauma informed. So I think when we make the shift to us, right, when we actually can start to have that perspective, I think it's whenever it's normal to look at your trauma from an early age. It's normal for a parent to not double down, but to say, you know what, I traumatized you.
Right.
And I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I was doing the best I could with the
Right.
resources I had at the time.
Right. Because
Which is
then what
true.
happens? It's the exponential effect.
Right.
Like, you got to think about this. The dishes are now clean, and the kitchen is now picked up every hour on the
Right.
hour.
Wow.
Right? It's someone's coming along and hitting it with some surface cleaner.
Right.
Right? Every now and then. And so
Yeah.
it goes from that exponential effect over a week. Now it's clean for a week. It's now a new exponential effect. So I think, the kid starts to figure out the trauma that they've subjected people to
Right.
in their, young adult life or adult life.
The ability to take responsibility at such a young age.
Yeah.
Wow. As we're talking through this, I'm also thinking about how there's another dynamic between fear and intuition that I don't think we've discussed yet. And that's how when we get into a really fearful state, this fight, flight, or freeze, we know from fMRI studies that certain regions of the brain, they go offline. There's no activity in those regions anymore, and there's heightened activity in others. And one of those regions that goes offline is the prefrontal cortex, which is the most highly developed portion of the human brain. And I suspect that it is intertwined with intuition on some level. I also suspect that the limbic system plays a role, but I just want to call our attention to how being in that state of fear can quite literally inhibit us from accessing certain native abilities that we have, one of which I think is very likely intuition. I think it's much more challenging to get in touch with that essential information. And this is like clear as day, right? You get really scared or really activated, and suddenly you start making really bad decisions.
Right.
Just like anybody could see. And it's like, why did you do that?
Right.
I was afraid.
Yeah.
I was like,
I don't know.
I was triggered.
Yeah.
I was angry, whatever.
And most people won't even admit that.
Right.
Like they'll say,
They'll just start defending
they'll find
the
a
decision.
them.
Yeah,
right?
it's somebody else's fault.
Yeah. Or this stupid computer won't let me do whatever. And no, I agree. Just say like what the reason that we made scientifically, according to many experts, the reason that over a 4 million period that we made some of the most significant leaps in terms of our species is our intelligence. So the prefrontal cortex is attributable to a lot of intelligence.
Right.
So when we get in these situations, we literally turn off what makes us unique as a species and revert back to somewhere between, 300,000 years and 4 million years, which is very interesting because we see that happen where it's just like, well, what were you what were you thinking? Like,
Yeah.
You know? So I agree. But there's nothing more, in my opinion, at least from what I observed, that will trigger somebody or even an environment that is cultivating fear than someone who decides to be emotionally intelligent about their own fear, right, and work through some of their trauma points. That is a person that doesn't, how is it described? Doesn't give their environment or people that they're around a good gut feeling. You know, it's kind of hard to trust a person who isn't acting normal.
Right.
Right.
You know, it's funny. I feel like every movement, the call to action is emotional.
It is.
You know, we need you to get in a certain state of mind, a very specific frame of reference to do what it is that we want you to do. And I think a lot of the time, like the primary culprits are fear and anger. Yeah. And there's a relationship, a well-documented relationship between fear and anger.
Right.
With, I think, fear oftentimes, or anger being the manifestation of fear. You know, it's like you're debilitated by fear, or you decide to do something about it, and that doing often comes through anger.
Right.
But just recognizing that that's like, we're not operating from a position of power there. That's a much earlier, much less developed frame of reference.
It is.
To be acting from.
What makes us unique is our intelligence.
Yeah.
And then now we get to be like emotionally intelligent,
What a gift.
which is like more evolved.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is, I agree, that is something that it doesn't work well if you're in an environment where people are filled with piss and vinegar or fear and anger, right?
Right.
And I think that is something that we need to continue to cultivate, is not only intelligence but emotional intelligence, being able to see your way through problems, fearful, like anxiety provoking problems, right, that are real, but being able to stay, practice stillness and calmness and equanimity in spite of the chaos that is everyday life. That, I think, has an exponential effect. So anyway, sorry.
No, that was absolutely beautiful, and I know we need to end now. So that was the perfect note to end on, ladies and gentlemen. Josiah Ball,
Chase Bryant.
The Enzo Project is brought to you by Bolt Human Capital and Noon Holdings. Edited by ELE. You can find the Enzo Project on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Music, the song Full Bloom by Jewel and Nuamina. You can find them wherever you listen to your music.